What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Kane the Conqueror. Now, one thing I do want to say, we will do Umbrella Academy Part 3. I'm probably going to release that on Friday, just because the Hotel Oblivion is a really difficult story to follow, because Gerard Way just wrote it in a really complicated way. So I need to read it a couple times in order to be able to make a video on it. That's how complicated it is. It's kind of nuts. But as you guys know, with Kane the Conqueror Volume 1, this story largely tells kind of the origin of Kang, but not really. That's kind of the difficulty of Kang, is that it's difficult to know exactly where he starts. The origin that we got here is that he was basically just a younger kid who existed in the 31st century and was plucked out of time by an older version of himself, and that basically that older version wanted to ensure that Kang the Conqueror, that he would actually be successful in terms of his various campaigns and whatnot, and the only way to do that was to rid his younger self of what he saw as weakness, so that by the time his younger self became him, that it would basically allow him to become more capable, right? He would actually be rid of all those different weaknesses that cost him various battles and things along those lines. However, there will be a major player that will appear here, and by and large, the rest of the story will basically proceed by giving that person a new origin story, which is kind of cool because it looks like they're doing it largely for the MCU. So as you guys know, in the last video that we did, you essentially had younger Kang, right? Nathaniel Richards. We'll just kind of call him that so we can differentiate between the two. Technically, both versions of Kang are Nathaniel, but it just makes it easier to differentiate between which characters we're talking about. That Nathaniel had essentially escaped what was the destruction or a meteor crashing into Earth and essentially ending the age of the dinosaurs, and then suddenly popped up here in ancient Egypt. Now, what this does is this takes place during the era of what is essentially Rama-Tut. Now, that's where things get a little murky, because when he shows up here, it's essentially a giant battle taking place. Now, this battle is between Rama-Tut and somebody else who we'll talk about here in a little bit, but on this battlefield is effectively a Moon Knight. Now, one of the reasons why Colin Kelly's able to pull this off is because, as you guys know, just from the history of Moon Knight in Marvel Comics, it wasn't really until Mark Spector was taken to the statue of Khonshu that the world got its first Moon Knight. Over the years, and really when I say over the years, I mean more recently in Marvel Comics, that's been changed, right? It's kind of been a big retcon to essentially say there have been different avatars of Khonshu on Earth in the form of a Moon Knight that came before Mark Spector. And it's not uncommon for Marvel to do that. For years, for example, Danny Rand was the only Iron Fist, and then we got Orson Randall, who was the Iron Fist before Danny Rand, and there were a whole bunch of Iron Fists before Orson Randall. It had just gone on that way. The idea of there being Moon Knights that took place or existed before Mark Spector, that was largely the result of Jason Aaron and his run on Avengers, specifically with Avengers 1 million. So basically this idea that there was an Avengers team that existed 1 million years before the modern era, it was largely composed of big heavy hitters, so like Odin, the original Phoenix Force as it existed on Earth, the first Star Brand, the first Iron Fist, the first Black Panther, different things along those lines, just kind of giving us these different stories. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. When it comes to Moon Knight, what you get here is basically this version that pops up. Now, there isn't a whole lot of explanation given here initially. Instead, what ends up happening is that this person is told, or at least Nathaniel's told by this Moon Knight, you are called by the moon. And initially when Nathaniel chases this Moon Knight down, trying to figure out who they are or where they're going or how all this is working, that the only thing he's really told is that the voice of the night speaks only truth. A hero from beyond time comes soon from the sky to restore the ancient ways and end the pretender's reign. Now, this is one of the things that we have to talk about here, is the nature of Rama-Tut and why it is that this version of Moon Knight differs from Mark Spector. So when it comes to Rama-Tut, one of the things that we've talked about before is that Kang the Conqueror, in his initial attempt for conquest, had gone all the way back to ancient Egypt and basically seized control. And because of the fact that he had come from the 31st century, as has been stated by different people and in different ways, that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so Kang the Conqueror showing up here with advanced technology, as far as the ancient Egyptians were concerned, he was a god. Right? They were like, this guy's just capable of incredible things. This is insane, right? Obviously, this person is a god. Now, pharaohs in the time of ancient Egypt were largely considered to be avatars of God, of specifically Ra or other individuals on Earth, but they were considered divine in nature. And so because of that, Kang kind of fit very nicely into how Egyptians perceived people, specifically pharaohs, and the idea of magic and divine powers. And so that's why he seized control here. Now, one of the things to know is that Khonshu and the various gods that existed had long since existed here. By and large, Khonshu doesn't really care what goes on Earth. He's got his own scheme and his own motivation. One of the things that's been recently established, especially during Jeff Lemire's run on Moon Knight, is that Khonshu seeks to basically find a vessel for himself to basically rule the world. Hence the reason why he manipulated Mark Spector and his dissociative identity disorder in order to hollow him out, quote unquote, and turn him into a vessel that Khonshu could inhabit and then rule the world. So Khonshu and the various other Egyptian gods don't necessarily concern themselves with the idea that like Kang the Conqueror has come from the future to the past in order to rule ancient Egypt. But one of the other things to notice here is that this version of Moon Knight wholly believes in what Khonshu told them. And not to sound too brusque about it, but the reason why is because they just don't know any better. By the time Mark Spector had become Moon Knight, people were more intelligent, they were more capable, and they were more aware of how the world exists. So the idea of gods and things like that had largely fallen away. This takes place during that era to a degree before the third celestial host, where you basically had the celestial showing up and telling the various gods of Earth not to intervene in the affairs of mortal men. It kind of falls during that bit of a murky period. We can largely assume that maybe that's already happened, but whatever it is, the influence of gods and goddesses on humanity still holds strong. And that's why this person who became Moon Knight hears the voice of Khonshu and takes it as an absolute truth. Because by the time Mark Spector came around in the 20th century, the idea of people believing in gods, sure, it was there, but they didn't believe it with the same veracity, right? They didn't believe it with the same absolute belief system. It was like, people believed in the idea of God because they were more afraid of the consequences of not believing than the actual benefit of believing, if there is one. And so as the two of them talk, when it comes to Nathaniel, remember, he knows the entire history of Earth. And so what he says is, he says, "Far be it for me to argue with my savior, but Rama-Tut isn't someone you can just hope to overthrow. Trust me, I've studied him for years." And the response to this person is, he's enslaved the entirety of creation. Now, as somebody who's never left Egypt, as far as they're concerned, Egypt is all of creation. And the influence of Rama-Tut just stretches into infinity. Now, of course, that's not the case. And Nathaniel says it's only really Egypt, but like, that's plenty of stuff to rule. He says, "It's his war machine against my broken suit of armor. I'm sorry, lady, but I'm not the hero that you're looking for. You're thinking of Reed Richards." Now, the reason why this matters, and I love that Colin Kelly did this, is because in the original story, when Rama-Tut first appeared in Marvel Comics, the Fantastic Four traveled back to Egypt, defeated Rama-Tut, and forced him to travel back to his timeline, right? They defeated that version of Kang. Now, again, as we discussed, along the way back to his timeline, he ended up in the true limbo, became Immortus, and then there's kind of a splinter timeline where he ended up going back and becoming Kang. But the reality here is that what you're doing, or at least what Colin Kelly's doing, is he's basically keeping the continuity of the history of Rama-Tut intact, but adding to it, which is a really cool thing, right? That's a pretty beneficial thing and a very important thing. But what goes on here is ultimately Nathaniel is taken to the temple of Khonshu and is basically told, like, talk to Khonshu itself and find out if there's any real truth here. The reality, though, is that Nathaniel doesn't really believe in gods. I mean, he knows that they've existed, but they're not all powerful beings. They don't really exist in the capacity the way that this Moon Knight believes they do, that they are just people that are out there and they can be killed. And so as a result of that, Nathaniel really views gods as more of just really powerful beings, as opposed to these divine individuals beyond the understanding of humanity and with a power that just simply can't be matched. The only real god that exists out there in Marvel Comics in that capacity is the one above all. Everybody else can just be killed. It just takes differing levels of power to do it. The Living Tribunal was killed by the Beyonders, the other cosmic entities as well, and the different cosmic entities have been destroyed by different beings, depending on what era of comics you're talking about. If you're looking at Al Ewing's Ultimates, that Eternity was basically defeated and not really killed, but overpowered by like the first firmament, right? The sentience of the first universe. So it gets a little meta and it gets a little wonky, but as the two of them continue talking, what ends up going on is that this person reveals their identity to Nathaniel Richards, and we end up finding out this Moon Knight is actually Ravonna Rinslayer. Now, here's the thing to understand here, and this is why I say from this point going forward, the entire history of Ravonna Rinslayer is going to be completely rewritten, or at least her origin is going to be completely rewritten. The original origin of Ravonna Rinslayer is she's from the 40th century, and that you ended up having a time where Kane the Conqueror had arrived there, but ultimately spared the place because he was in love with her. And then it was a kind of love-hate relationship where they loved each other, then they hated each other. She killed him a couple times. It was just one of those things. There was literally a point where she resurrected him just to kill him. It's kind of nuts, right? It was that level of hate and disdain, but it was very much a love-hate, if anything, a passionate relationship between the two. What it looks like Colin Kelly's doing is reworking the entirety of that by introducing Ravonna Rinslayer here and saying she is a Moon Knight and then presenting her to us in this way. What it looks like is this is where Ravonna Rinslayer starts. This is where her origin begins. Instead of it being in the 40th century, she was just a person in Egypt and ended up becoming a host for Khonshu as the first Moon Knight, or one of the Moon Knights, presumably the second Moon Knight after Avengers 1,000,000, and she just kind of goes forward from there. But again, things will be explained as time effectively goes on, because we'll actually see different versions of her in different points in time across this story. So it'll be a little murky to a degree, not gonna lie, a little ambiguous there, but at the end of the day, she presents herself as a person that wholeheartedly believes in the idea of Khonshu. And what ends up happening is Nathaniel kind of says, I do not believe in gods. In my life of conquest, I have crushed countless divine skulls in my hands, but even before I saw fear in the eyes of the god of thunder, and yet he recalls those thoughts by Kang, never love. And he says, in that place, my mind ran clear. The past, the future, like a river of blood from my mind to Kang's neurokinetic armor. Time and memory coursed through my veins. I swore that I would be the hero she saw in me. I swore to tear him down. And she says, in the shadow of a dead god, I took my revenge and cast it in iron. And so what this says, and this isn't necessarily something that's absolutely solidified in the modern era, what this says is that this younger version of Kang basically becomes the first Iron Lad. Now, I say that as if there's more than one Iron Lad. I mean, I guess technically there kind of is, but not necessarily. The reality here is that in the end, it is all Kang, right? So this kind of origin still rings true, right? The origin of Kang. But one of the things to know is that in the old school, or not really old school, but in the Young Avengers stories, that the idea of Iron Lad was basically a younger version of Kang that didn't want to become Kang and did everything he could not to become Kang. But in the end, every origin of everybody stems from Kang in the 30th and 31st centuries. And so because of that, they are all destined to become Kang. Eventually, Immortus goes on to become Kang. Iron Lad goes on to become Kang. Everybody originates from Kang because he was a guy that basically went back in time and initially started it all. And that's why if you look at characters like Kang the Conqueror, or even like Reverse Flash, Eobard Thawne in DC Comics, the reason why they're basically indestructible in the sense that you can never truly kill them is because they effectively exist simultaneously at different points in time. And so because they exist at different points in time, they can always reappear at any point in time. So imagine you, for example, traveled back to, I don't know, like the 1st century, right? Just some arbitrary point in time. You exist in the 1st century, but because we have branch universe theory, there's also a reality or a timeline where you never traveled back in time. And so if somebody were to go to that point where you quote unquote went back in time, and they stopped you the moment before you did and they killed you, then what that would mean is you would still exist in the 1st century. You would still be there. Instead, there's a branch universe that exists out there now where you died before you could go back in time. So you could never truly kill that person. It's one of those things where in Marvel and even DC Comics, once a person learns the ability to travel through the time stream, the instant they make their first attempt or their first travel through time, they can never truly be destroyed now. They can always just reappear at any point in time. So it's really kind of murky, and it's very, very ambiguous. And I know when it comes to time travel, it can be a little confusing, but it's essentially a way to unlock immortality using technological means. But the result of this is that as Iron Lad, really the first time he becomes this character, he basically ends up helping the forces of Moon Knight and this, what seems to be this rebel faction, facing off against Rama-Tut and trying to bring down his rule. Now, the reality of this, and what's really, really cool, is that in these various battles that they're a part of, there is a larger force pulling the strings when it comes to these forces that are trying to destroy or bring down Kane the Conqueror. We'll get to them here in a second, although I imagine some of you guys have already guessed who that person is. One of the greatest characters of all time, whom I absolutely love. But one of the things to know is that as these battles are fought, that it's really more of a series of battles as part of a continuous war. And as you know, battles end. And so in these bits of lulls, there's a very deep and personal connection that's formed between Nathaniel and Ravonna Rinslayer. And it's kind of interesting because she asked the question, in the place that you come from, is this place remembered? And he says, in the time that I come from, everything is remembered imperfectly and through the lens of the victim. victors perhaps, but remembered all the same. That was the problem. When everything's been done before you, what can your life possibly be worth? But I knew I was destined for more. Even before Kang came to visit me, I knew. And the response of Ravonna is, I have never known a life without destiny. I remember nothing before it. My parents were the will of Khonshu, and they have long ago vanished into the sunlight of my memory, if they were ever there at all. And the response here is that Nathaniel asks, did he give you your name, your God? And her response is, no, my name has always been, but he did give me yours. And that's when she says, like, I was told you were coming here. But in this moment, he recalls the words that Kang had spoken to him when he was effectively trying to rid him of weakness and saying, never love, lest you be conquered. But the thought of Nathaniel here is, but he knew nothing of love, I was absolutely sure. He was a creature of hate. When you are young, it is so hard to see that one is only born from the other, that without love to inspire it, hate is simply just rage. Anger can be conquered by calm, but like its pathetic cousin regret, hatred just feeds. It makes one ruthless. It drives the preparation of armories and the shattering of centuries. It intertwines with the power of a parasite around the brainstem. Love makes one blind as hatred makes one see. And it is in that way that we fell under his eye. What Nathaniel's really saying here is that when it comes to the ideas of love and hate, they really are intertwined. Kang hates the person he became because he experienced love, because he fell in love with Ravonna Rinslayer, and he saw that idea of love as the thing that made him weak, that rage is directionless. Rage has no real drive or ambition. It's a thing that exists as a byproduct of experiences, things that have maybe happened to you, but it's not necessarily born in love. But love is an intensely positive emotion, and I would argue the most positive emotion. Hate can be born out of love, which drives you to the most negative emotion. The reality here is that he sees Kang as becoming the person he did because he experienced love. But in his desire to refuse to become Kang, he embraces love. He seeks love. And in fact, that's where he and Ravonna Rinslayer effectively fall in love. Now again, this is why I say this new origin of Ravonna Rinslayer is a little ambiguous here, because the answers she gives Nathaniel on her origin are cloak and dagger at best, right? And it may just be smoke and mirrors. She's like, well, I've always had my name. Maybe it's a name that was given me by my parents, but I don't really even know if my parents existed anymore, right? The memory of them is basically gone. And it's one of those weird things, because you would think that for a person her age, which, you know, just going on the way she's drawn, looks to be maybe in her late 20s, early 30s, she would very definitely remember her parents. But the idea here is that potentially her parents may have died and when she was at a very young age, in which case it may be one of those things where her memory just doesn't really recall a lot of her parents because she was so young when they died. There's no definitive answers given here, but you could look at it from a different perspective and say she's very much like Rama-Tut. She basically came here at some past point in time, and she came here from the future because of all the different adventures and escapades she'd gone on. But at the end of the day, she's just following the same path as Rama-Tut. She doesn't remember a whole lot about herself. But what goes on is that once the two of them are captured and they're brought before Rama-Tut, that initially Rama-Tut actually ends up blasting Ravonna Rinslayer with what's known as the Ultra Diode Ray. And it's basically a weapon well used by Kane the Conqueror, is how he ensnared a lot of the people under his service and basically forces her into a position of being a subject, right? It takes away her willpower. And in fact, that seemed to be the way in which he was able to form his initial higher council and then in turn position himself as a god king. Now, the response of Nathaniel is, of course, to lash out. One part because he's in love with her, and two, because he knows that Rama-Tut is king from a different point in time. Now remember, as time would pass, Kane the Conqueror and Rama-Tut would eventually become their own distinct personalities. But Rama-Tut does remember his idea, or remember him being king at one point in time, and so that's why he kind of recognizes Nathaniel Richards to a degree insofar as like Iron Lad, different things like that, but he doesn't have any memory of this sort of encounter taking place because it's never happened before, or at least it doesn't seem to have happened before. One of the big issues is that King's entire history is a time loop, and so seemingly this has happened before. It's just for whatever reason, every time feels like the first time, which is kind of weird. I know we're not even going to go into that because it just seems wonky. It just seems really, really meta, and honestly would just take too long to explain. But at the end of the day, Rama Rama-Tut really says, like, I have no memory of this, right? A divergent timeline, perhaps some kind of a variant or a new loop, whatever it is. What this means is that killing you would no more affect me than the destruction of an alien sun. And the response to Nathaniel is smart here. He says, but Rama-Tut is a footnote in our story, barely even a prologue. You don't even know our true name. I would think very hard before you execute me. The throat you slit may very well be your own. That means Kane the Conqueror will never come into existence. And if Kane the Conqueror never comes into existence, there's no one to come back in time and to be you. Now, the reality here is that Colin Kelly is jumping back and forth between a linear timeline and branch universe theory. The reality here is, based on Marvel's branch universe theory, if Rama-Tut were to kill basically Iron Lad, it wouldn't make any difference. It would have no real involvement in any real capacity whatsoever. It would just be a thing that happens, and that would basically be it. That's kind of how that branch universe theory concept works in Marvel Comics. But at the end of the day, what he says is, you know what, you're absolutely right here. Killing you is too much of a risk. However, using you is a great strategy because you're technologically advanced. You have access to essentially all my resources and even some of the resources that I don't have access to. So we'll turn you into a servant instead of killing you. And so by blasting him, he basically turns him into what is in effect the first Scarlet Centurion. Now, one of the big differences between this and comics as they were originally written is that when Kane the Conqueror was on his way back to his time stream, he did end up arriving in the modern era due to a time storm and encountered Doctor Doom. In their first encounter, and somewhat inspired by Doctor Doom's armor, basically Kane got rid of the Rama-Tut guys and then basically started calling himself a Scarlet Centurion. Of course, again, that was covered in, well, it was covered in a few different places. It was like Avengers Annual number 2. God, it was like Captain America Annual number 11. And I want to say it was in Fantastic Four. No, it wasn't. It was a What If story. I don't remember the exact issue of the What If story. I think it was issue number 20. Yeah, it was What If issue number 29 that all this stuff was basically explained and whatnot. But the thing behind this is that giving us this indication as the first Scarlet Centurion, what it does is it sets the stage for the idea that in a lot of ways, Kane the Conqueror just kind of inspired himself to become the people that he was. But making Nathaniel into Scarlet Centurion, he ends up leading the forces of Kane the Conqueror, albeit against his will, against the force that is controlling all these individuals out there that are fighting against the rule of Rama-Tut and trying to conquer his kingdom. Of course, all of them being led by Apocalypse, which I love. Now, this is one of the things where Colin Kelly's basically kind of blowing off the old adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, which is where you got the initial origin of Apocalypse, where basically he was rising to power around the same time that Rama-Tut was defeated. And the way he's depicted in this comic, he's already in possession of celestial technology. That hadn't happened yet in the old school story. So basically it's Colin Kelly kind of rewriting the history of Apocalypse to a degree, which is fine. The origin of Apocalypse, I mean, it's there, but I never really took it as an absolute truth, that it's one of those things where anybody could rewrite it in virtually any way, and it's fine if they did. For the most part, people don't really care about Apocalypse before he became Apocalypse. They care about him after he became Apocalypse, because that's when he got awesome, right? So it's cool to see him leading this force. Now, of course, with Apocalypse at what is in effect the height of his power, because once he achieved this level, his power never really increased. He was just at this state for seemingly thousands of years before the modern era. But the thing about this is that at this point in time, he's wildly powerful and wildly capable. But in the end, the battle is a pretty severe and extreme battle. And so what Nathaniel says is that it was in those days that I first knew war. I learned the way a scream sounds when it is someone's last, and how fear alone can stop a heartbeat even before death. Love made me blind, and so I began to hate. I saw the only path forward. My body was a prison, my armor a cage. To escape Kang's power, both needed to be broken. And he says, and through the pain, I swore I will have revenge on Kang. I will have revenge on Kang. And that's the thing he keeps saying to motivate himself. And that's the thing he kept saying to remind himself. Now, by the time he gets back to the Citadel of Kang, where Kang is basically operating, that's when he sees the Fantastic Four fighting against Kang and then ultimately pushing him back to his timeline. And of course, that's how his history kind of unfolds. The original Scarlet Centurion as we initially saw him in the old Fantastic Four comics, and so on and so forth. But the reality here is he says that within a day of Rama-Tut's escape into the time stream, his kingdom fell to chaos, that Apocalypse took all he wished and burned the remnants. No record of Ravonna Rinslayer, like a footprint in the sands of the desert. She was scattered to time. I told myself a lie in those days. None sun are lost in the light of the moon, but I knew better than to believe it. She was as dead as the god she served, but Kang was still alive. And so that's why things are a little murky here, is because again, maybe Ravonna Rinslayer comes from the future, she went to the past, she basically forgot her own history and believes she had always just existed there and then became a Moon Knight. It's one of those things that we'll explore as the story goes on. But the final act in basically trying to get back to his time, because in effect, he doesn't really have the same level of technology that he used to have, he's stuck in his Scarlet Centurion suit, is he goes to the only person who has a level of power that could get him through the time stream. He goes to Apocalypse and he simply says, together we can destroy Kang the Conqueror. Because that's one of the things to understand. Apocalypse is on a level of power to where somebody like Kang, he understands the danger he poses, but he's not afraid of him. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.